Okay, grade 11, here we are again with our slave narrative part 2. Part 2. And you can also find some information about this topic if you follow this link. Okay, so it's the HMH website. HMH is the publisher which produces your books, your literature books, and many others. Okay, so and on we go with slave narrative. Okay, yesterday we discussed 12 Years of Slave by Solomon Northup, and before we discussed narrative of Frederick Douglass. Today, important thing that those two works have in common is that they're both written by men. Okay, now we have another book, another account of those events titled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by Harriet Jacobs. You can find some pages from that text, from that book, in your literature books on page 550 to 561. The last two pages, 560 and 561, show you two songs written by slaves, and one of the songs we will listen in the end of the class today. Okay, so now this is what Harriet Jacobs tells us in the beginning of her narrative. Reader, it is not to awaken sympathy for myself that I am telling you truthfully what I suffered. I do it to kindle a flame of compassion in your hearts for my sisters who are still in bondage. Okay, with these words, Harriet Jacobs, speaking through her narrator, Linda Brandt, reveals her reasons for deciding to make her personal story of enslavement, degradation, and sexual exploitation publicly. Although generally ignored by critics who often dismissed Jacobs' book as a fictionalized account of slavery, the work is heralded today as the first book-length narrative by an ex-slave that reveals the unique brutalities inflicted on enslaved women. As such, it is often cited as the counterpart to the narrative of Frederick Douglass. You remember, I mentioned already that Frederick Douglass and Solomon Northup were both men, and they were writing their narratives through their eyes, right, through the man's eyes. Okay, while here in this situation we see the female account of these events. Now you will refer to page 550 in your book to read a short biography of Harriet Jacobs. For that you have 5 minutes. Press pause and take your time. Now, about the book. History. First published in 1861, Incidents was discovered only in the 1970s and reprinted in 1973 and 1987. Since then, several editors of Incidents, several editions have been published. The most complete and comprehensive version of the narrative is the 1987 Harvard University Press edition, edited by Jacobs' biographer, Jean Fagan Yelin, a professor at New York's Pace University. And this edition is very, very important for us because it proves several important things, including authorship of the book, because before most critics were even doubtful about the authorship, if it was Harriet or was not, if it was someone else, if it really was Brandt or whoever. So, in addition to her efforts to establish the authenticity of Jacobs' narrative, Yelin also brought Incidents to the attention of readers, scholars, and critics who had long ignored or dismissed the work because it failed to meet the standards of the male slave narrative. It's obvious. Look, you can take a novel written by a man, you can take a novel written by a woman, and if you compare them, the structure and many things inside most likely will be different, because men and women tend to think differently. It is obvious that male slave narrative does not have to be the same as female slave narrative, and vice versa. So, scholars who dismiss the work as a fictional slave narrative often pointed out issues such as following. Unlike conventional slave narratives, Incidents does not acknowledge Harriet Jacobs as its author. Instead, the narrative was published under the pseudonym Linda Brandt. The narrative's formal, sometimes melodramatic style that emulates the style of the 19th century romantic novel seemed totally inappropriate for its delicate subject matter, the sexual abuse of enslaved black women. Its stranger-than-fiction account of a woman who spent 7 years hiding in her grandmother's attic to escape her master's insatiable lust seemed too fantastic to be believed. The primary goal of slave narratives was to arouse sympathy among whites and gain their support for the anti-slavery movement led by abolitionists. Because the publication of Incidents coincided with the beginning of the Civil War, it was seen as being published too late to have any social or political impact. Okay, so which means this point. So the critics who use this point against the book, they mean that this book was too late for all that impact that male narrative did before. The majority of slave narratives were written by men who documented their daring escapes and heroic actions, many of whom, such as Frederick Douglass, went on to become spokespersons or political leaders. In contrast, Jacob's story, which focused primarily on her family, was viewed as less important than the stories of her male counterparts. Male narratives generally followed a strictly chronological format, focusing on the narrator's life as he relates the story of his journey from slavery to freedom. Okay, if you take the book of Frederick, he starts from his childhood, and then he tells about his life as a slave, and then how he learns to read, and then how he gets educated, and then his master learns and he tries to escape, and so chronological order. The same with Solomon. But in contrast, Jacob's narrative focuses on incidents in her life. Even the title says incidents. Okay. Moreover, instead of following a strictly chronological pattern, Jacobs often interrupts her narrative to address social or political issues such as the church and slavery, or the impact of the fugitive slave law on runaways. Consequently, her narrative did not fit the pattern of the authentic male narrative. It was very different in style and in techniques. However, Yeleen's discovery of letters documenting the correspondence between Jacobs and several prominent 19th century figures has established the authenticity of Jacobs' narrative and distinguished it as one of the most powerful and courageous works of its time. For contemporary readers, skepticism generally revolves around the use of language. Critics have pointed out that Jacob's narrative often depicts Linda as the tragic heroine of British romance novels rather than as an enslaved black woman fighting for survival. They also note that Dr. Flint is sometimes depicted more like a suitor or persistent lover determined to win the hand of his lady, rather than a slave owner determined to hold on to his property. Readers may also get this idea because Linda, rather than trying to escape, chooses to have 2 children by Mr. Sands, another white man, a decision that she sees as the lesser of 2 evils. So readers may conclude that she contributes to her own bondage. Thus, although she uses her sexuality to try to escape her fate, she is ultimately trapped by it. And although Jacobs used the style of the 19th century romance in writing her narrative, presumably because it was the only model available to her, the content of her narrative focuses on her own experiences and not on the experiences of a fictional protagonist. In conducting her research, Yelin also discovered a narrative written by Jacob's brother John, titled A True Tale. The narrative authenticates Jacob's experience and provides a male perspective on many of the events described in Incidents. So, key themes. Key themes in the Incidents include the economics of slavery, the quest for freedom, pain and suffering, physical pain, emotional suffering, self-definition, self-assertion, community support and family loyalty. By the way, this part generally lacks in slave narratives by men. Writing as means of freedom, self-expression and resistance. Also significant is the issue of literacy, which was often used as a metaphor for freedom, because slaves who learned to read and write were often the ones who ran away. For example, the letters Linda writes while hiding in her grandmother's attic play an important part in her eventual escape. Other themes include the moral conflict between slavery and Christianity, color prejudice and racism, the bond of motherhood, and the theme of abandonment. About the structure and chronology. We already discussed this part before, but just to summarize, Incidents can be divided into 5 different parts, each focusing on significant events in Linda's life. Consequently, the structure deviates from that of the traditional slave narrative. As I said, slave narrative normally goes A, B, C, D, E, from birth to death, or from birth to freedom. Although some chapter focuses strictly on Linda's story, like for example chapters 1 and 2, others provide social, political or historical commentary, or sometimes stories and anecdotes from lives of other slaves. Like for example, even in chapter 3 you meet a completely different character and Linda tells you the story of a different person. Okay, so the work also offers a new perspective on many historical events. Incidents is therefore unique in that it addresses a specific audience. Normally, slave narratives, those books were addressed to any literate man. Okay, so and mostly men were reading them. But Incidents is unique because it addresses white women in the North and speaks for black women still held in bondage. So, in her book, Harriet addresses white women as her sisters, and she's telling about black women as her sisters. So, this way she builds up a kind of sisterhood between herself, other black slaves, and white readers. I guess it's pretty interesting.